Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going way back to November 22nd, 1963, and the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know, this is heavy stuff. But we've got some really interesting stuff to dig into today.
I love it.
You gave me some excerpts from the Dealey Plaza Echo, Volume 13, Issue 3, which, just so everybody knows, that's a research journal. It's dedicated to study the assassination.
Right.
And it really goes deep into some intriguing stuff. We're going to be focusing on the discrepancies and unanswered questions surrounding the physical evidence found at the Texas School Book Depository.
Yeah.
Right where it all happened.
Yeah.
As well as some of the eyewitness accounts that came out of that day.
It's amazing, this case, even decades later, new evidence or theories pop up that just reignite debate.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And this journal does a great job of constantly examining and re-examining history. So
yeah.
Let's jump right in.
Okay.
The first thing I want to talk about is this whole thing with Captain Will Fritz.
Okay.
He was the head of the Dallas Police Homicide Division.
Right.
So he was the guy in charge of the investigation at the Texas School Book Depository right after the assassination.
Right.
This issue of the Dealey Plaza Echo really highlights the claims of a Dallas reporter named Tom Elia, who was there. Like, he was actually present on the 6th floor of the depository not long after the assassination.
Wow.
Yeah, and he claims he saw Captain Fritz actually handling some key evidence, specifically the spent cartridges.
Oh, wow.
From the rifle.
Right.
Before the crime scene team.
Oh, before they were properly documented.
Before they were documented.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty big deal, right?
Yeah. That's tampering with evidence at a crime scene like that. That has huge implications for the whole case.
Yeah. I mean, it makes you wonder if there was something that they were trying to hide. Or I mean, what's the explanation there?
Well, the journal goes on to point to some Warren Commission testimonies. Specifically, a Detective Studebaker. He was another Dallas police officer. And he admits under oath that he moved some items on the 6th floor before the crime scene team could even photograph them.
Hold on. So they're moving stuff around before they're even taking pictures of it?
Well, he says he put them back where he thought they were originally. But that raises the question of, was he right? And also, why is he even touching this stuff?
Right. Right. And these items that he moved, what were they?
So this is pretty important. It included the 3 boxes that were found near the sniper's nest window.
Oh, so the ones that they said were, the gun rest.
Exactly. The ones that Oswald supposedly used as a gun rest.
Right.
But the fact that they were moved at all before being documented really raises serious questions about how carefully that crime scene was handled.
Yeah, it does. So we have one officer admitting to moving potential evidence. What about those spent cartridges? Did anybody else back up Elia's claims about Captain Fritz messing around with them?
Yeah, so here's where it gets really interesting. The journal highlights these contradictions in some of the other officers' testimonies.
Okay.
For example, Detective Sims. At first, he said he couldn't remember what happened to the cartridges. But then later, after talking with Captain Fritz and another officer, he suddenly remembers.
Oh.
And he says that he put them in an envelope and delivered them to Fritz's office. So, was his memory jogged? Or was it something else?
It sounds more like, I don't know, somebody got to him, right? Some coaching was going on there.
Yeah. And to make matters even worse, Captain Fritz himself, he testified that he told all of his men, don't touch anything, leave everything as it is.
Okay.
But then later on, he admits that he didn't actually stick around to watch the cartridges being photographed.
So he wasn't even supervising. I mean, that's so strange, right? So you've got these conflicting accounts, people's memories changing, and nobody really seems to be taking charge of that crime scene in the way that you would expect in a case like this.
Right. And this potentially compromised evidence at the crime scene kind of leads us to another fascinating part of this whole story.
Okay.
Which is Oswald's rooming house at 1026 North Beckley Avenue.
Okay.
It seems like there might be some more inconsistencies with the official narrative there as well.
All right, let's hear about it. What's going on at the rooming house?
So there's a former tenant. He's only identified as Mike in the journal. And he offers a very different perspective.
Okay.
That really challenges the official record. For instance, Mike says that there were far fewer rooms and tenants than what the rooming house owners told the Warren Commission.
So is this like a case of people just not remembering things correctly, or is there something more deliberate going on? Like, were they trying to hide something?
Right. And the journal actually points out this lack of documentation, like receipts or a detailed register book, which makes the whole thing even more suspicious. It's like, if you had all these tenants, where's the paperwork?
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so we've got questions about the number of tenants. What else stands out from Mike's account?
One of the most interesting things is that Mike claims that Oswald received multiple phone calls while he was living there, and they were in Russian.
Wait, phone calls in Russian. This is during the Cold War.
Exactly. And these calls were witnessed by Mike and a few other tenants, and they raise a lot of questions about Oswald's potential connections, like who was he talking to? Why Russian? It seems like it should have been a huge red flag for investigators.
Absolutely. But what's even more baffling is that the Warren Commission doesn't even seem to have looked into this at all. They didn't interview any of the other tenants at 1026 North Beckley, which is a pretty big oversight.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if they were trying to avoid any information that didn't fit their narrative.
Okay, so we've got conflicting accounts about the rooming house, these mysterious phone calls in Russian, and a failure to follow up with potential witnesses. This deep dive is already getting pretty deep, but it doesn't stop there. The journal also takes a look at those 3 cardboard boxes that were found near the sniper's nest window, the ones that supposedly were Oswald's gun rest.
Right. And this is where it gets really thought-provoking.
Oh.
We know they were moved before being photographed, but the journal actually presents evidence that challenges the assumption that they were a gun rest at all.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, there are a couple of eyewitness accounts that are mentioned. One from Howard Brennan, who witnessed the shooting from across the street, and another from Amos Ewens, who was standing closer to the depository. They both describe seeing the sniper firing from the window,
Yeah.
but their descriptions don't match up with the idea of the boxes being used as a gun rest.
So we have eyewitness accounts that contradict the physical evidence. Is there anything else that casts doubt on the boxes as a gun rest?
Yeah, well, remember Detective Studebaker, the one who moved the boxes? He testified that based on his observation, a gunman using them as a gun rest wouldn't have been easily visible from street level. And this goes against what Brennan and Ewens said, because they both claim they had a clear view of the sniper.
So we have the eyewitnesses disagreeing with the physical evidence and a police officer disagreeing with the eyewitnesses. It's like a big, tangled mess.
It is, and the journal brings up this really simple but important question. If Oswald was the lone gunman, why would he set up a gun rest and then not even use it?
Yeah, that's a good question. What possible answers does the journal give?
Well, they explore a few different possibilities. Maybe the boxes were there for something totally unrelated, or maybe someone else put them there.
Maybe to frame Oswald.
Yeah, the idea of a fabricated crime scene.
Wow. If that's true, it suggests that someone went to a lot of trouble to make it look like Oswald did it.
And that leads us to another fascinating detail that's mentioned in the journal. Howard Brennan, the eyewitness we talked about earlier, he specifically mentioned that he could see all of the barrel of the rifle. And that wouldn't have been possible if it was resting on those boxes, like the Warren Commission said.
Picking up where we left off, you mentioned a fabricated crime scene. When talking about the boxes, what exactly does that mean in this context?
Well, it's a bold theory,
Yeah.
for sure. But the journal presents it as a legitimate question. Essentially, it suggests that the boxes, along with maybe other elements of the sniper's nest, might have been placed there deliberately to frame Oswald.
But wouldn't you think that creating a gun rest and then not even using it would be a little too obvious? Seems kind of sloppy for framing someone, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. That's a valid point. But it's important to remember the journal is presenting different perspectives, not necessarily saying anyone is correct.
Right.
It's really up to the reader, or in our case, the listener, to weigh the evidence and decide what they think is most plausible.
Right. Which is what I love about these deep dives. It's not about telling you what to think. It's about giving you all the information so you can make up your own mind.
Exact.
So, speaking of challenging the official narrative, let's go back to those mysterious phone calls in Russian that Oswald was supposedly receiving at his rooming house.
Oh, yeah.
The journal mentions other tenants, besides Mike, knew about these calls. So is there any more information about who these callers might have been?
So, the journal doesn't give us any specific details about their identities. All we know is that they were speaking Russian. And apparently they had pretty heavy accents, so it seems like they weren't native English speakers.
And to add to the mystery, we already know that none of those other tenants who could have corroborated these calls were ever interviewed by the Warren Commission. Like, it's almost as if they were deliberately trying to avoid that information.
Yeah.
That didn't fit their narrative.
It's a curious omission. There's no doubt about that. It brings us back to that central theme running through this journal, that maybe there was a real effort to suppress information that didn't fit the official narrative, the narrative that Oswald acted alone.
Now, before we move on, I want to circle back to something we touched upon in part one.
Yeah.
The death of Martin Schramm.
Okay.
The journal mentions that he served with Oswald in the Marines and that his death was surrounded by rumors, speculation.
Right.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
So Schramm actually died while he was on guard duty in the Philippines back in 1958. Officially, it was ruled an accident, but the circumstances are pretty strange. He was found with a single gunshot wound to the chest, and his own shotgun was nearby.
So an accidental shooting. What's so strange about that? It happens, right?
Well, as the journal points out, Schramm was a highly trained Marine.
Yeah.
It seems unusual for him to accidentally shoot himself, especially given the position of the wound and the fact that his shotgun had a safety catch.
So if it wasn't an accident, what are we talking about? Suicide? Was it foul play?
Well, the journal doesn't really give a definitive answer, but there are some interesting details that they mention. For one thing, there are rumors circulating among some of the Marines that Oswald was somehow involved.
Oswald? But how?
Well, the journal mentions a potential homosexual encounter gone wrong.
Oh, wow.
There was speculation that Schramm might have been engaging in homosexual activity with a Filipino boy, and that Oswald might have been implicated somehow.
Wow. So that's a pretty serious accusation. Is there any evidence to support that?
Well, the journal doesn't present any hard evidence. They just say these were rumors.
Okay.
It's important to remember this was a very different time. Homosexuality was incredibly taboo, especially in the military. Even unfounded accusations could ruin someone's career.
Yeah, I can see how these rumors, regardless of whether they were true or not, could have really damaged anyone connected to them. But what does any of this have to do with the JFK assassination?
Well, the journal suggests that these rumors, whether they were true or not, might have actually played a role in how Oswald was perceived. You know, the Warren Commission was tasked with investigating his background, his motivations. And even if they were unfounded, rumors like that would have painted him in a negative light.
It's almost like they were looking for anything to confirm their theory that Oswald was a troubled loner, capable of this act.
Yeah.
And speaking of official stories,
Right.
the journal also takes a look at the infamous single bullet theory. So for those who aren't familiar with that, can you give us a quick rundown?
Yeah, so the single bullet theory is how the Warren Commission explained how one bullet caused all the non-fatal wounds to both President Kennedy and Governor Connolly, who was sitting in front of him.
So one bullet, multiple wounds. That always seemed a little bit far-fetched to me.
Well, it does to a lot of people. The theory depends on the bullet's trajectory and the timing of the shots. So according to the Warren Commission, a single bullet, fired from the book depository, entered Kennedy's back, exited his throat, then entered Connolly's back, exited his chest, shattered his wrist, and then finally lodged in his thigh.
That's a busy bullet.
It is.
That sounds more like a scene from a movie than real life.
But the journal points out some inconsistencies with this theory, right?
They do. They focus specifically on Governor Connolly's thigh wound.
Okay.
So the Warren Commission said that the bullet in question, this is Commission Exhibit 399, was found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital after it fell out of Connolly's wound.
Okay.
However, the journal brings up evidence that challenges both the bullet's chain of custody and the nature of the wound itself.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. What's the issue with the bullet's chain of custody?
Well, for one thing, the journal cites interviews with several people who handled the bullet at Parkland, including O.P. Wright, the director of personnel there. He claimed that the bullet that he saw was pointed, not rounded, like the bullet that presented as Exhibit 399. So we're talking about a potential bullet swap. Why would anyone do that?
That's the million-dollar question. The journal doesn't explicitly say, but a pointed bullet doesn't really fit the single bullet theory. A rounded bullet is much more likely to have tumbled and fragmented after passing through multiple bodies.
Makes sense. So we have a potential issue with the bullet itself. What about the nature of Connolly's thigh wound? What inconsistencies does the journal highlight there?
Well, the journal points out that Dr. Thomas Shires, he was the surgeon who treated Connolly, described the thigh wound as being tangential.
Okay.
So this means a bullet might have hit at an angle and left a fragment, or maybe a stray fragment alone caused the wound. But this contradicts the idea of the bullet passing straight through the thigh, which is what the single bullet theory claims.
So we have conflicting accounts about the bullet, maybe even a different bullet altogether, and then a medical opinion that challenges the bullet's path. This is getting very complicated.
It is. And to make things even more confusing, the journal mentions how pristine the bullet was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Despite supposedly passing through multiple bones and bodies, it just doesn't really seem to add up.
Yeah, a pristine bullet after all that.
Yeah.
I can definitely see why people would be skeptical.
Right. And the journal ultimately concludes that the single bullet theory, despite being a key piece of evidence for the Warren Commission, remains very much contested.
It's incredible how many layers of intrigue there are to this case. We've covered potential issues with the evidence at the sniper's nest, conflicting accounts about Oswald's life at his rooming house, those unexplained phone calls in Russian, the mysterious death of a fellow Marine, and now doubts about the single bullet theory. There's just so much that doesn't add up.
It really is.
It really is. And I think as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into these excerpts from the Dealey Plaza Echo, it's important to remember that the assassination of President Kennedy wasn't just some, isolated event.
Right.
I mean, this
sent shockwaves to the whole world.
Absolutely. And we're still, still feeling the impact.
Absolutely.
To this day.
Yeah. And I think, while we've been focusing on these specific discrepancies and unanswered questions, we also have to acknowledge just the sheer number of conspiracy theories that this event has generated.
Oh, yeah. Some are more plausible than others, for sure.
Yeah.
But the fact that there are so many really points to this, deep mistrust.
Yeah. Yeah. A mistrust in the official story.
Right.
Mistrust in the government's investigation. And maybe even mistrust in history itself.
Exactly. And I think that mistrust is a big part of why this event still fascinates people. It represents this moment where a lot of people started to question the information they were being given.
And look for other explanations, different perspectives.
Which is kind of what we've tried to do today, to present a balanced look at the material you gave us.
Yeah.
We've highlighted the discrepancies,
right,
the inconsistencies,
yeah,
the things that just don't make sense. And now it's really up to you, the listener, to decide what you find most compelling.
That's right. Because the search for truth is a personal journey.
It is. It requires critical thinking, an open mind, a willingness to to question what you think you know.
Yeah.
So as we conclude our deep dive into President Kennedy's assassination, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
If the official story of this event could be inaccurate,
right,
or at least incomplete,
what other historical events might be shrouded in misinformation?
Yeah. What other truths might we be missing?
It's definitely something to think about.
It is.
So, until next time.
Yes.
Keep asking those questions, keep exploring.
Keep diving deep.
And keep diving deep.